Tuesday night. Screamed at 2 a.m. The power to my house had been cut. On purpose. My husband ran outside screaming for help. Neighbors peeked through blinds. Nobody moved. I stayed calm. Instead. Down the street, a woman watched from her porch. Smiling. She had no idea what was coming for her. My name is Elena Marsh. 34. A former ICU nurse turned patient. 6 months ago, a viral infection destroyed part of my heart. And I came home from the hospital tethered to a ventilator assist unit that runs on grid power. Backed by a small medical generator my husband, Daniel, installed in our side yard. We live in Maple Ridge Estates with our 7-year-old daughter, Sophie, in the small brick house we bought before I got sick. Daniel works nights at the freight yard so he can be home during my worst hours. Our life had shrunk to machines, oxygen tanks, and careful gratitude for each ordinary morning. Maple Ridge Estates had one thing everybody warned us about before we signed the closing papers. The HOA. Rules on mailbox color, grass height, holiday lights taken down by January 2nd. Mostly harmless, mostly ignored, until a woman named Deborah Voss became president 18 months ago. Deborah ran unopposed. The seat had been vacant for months and nobody wanted the paperwork. She showed up to that meeting with a binder, a laminated rulebook, and a smile that never quite reached her eyes. By the second week, she'd find 3 houses for trash cans left out an hour too long. When Daniel installed my medical generator, he called the HOA office first, like a good neighbor does. A tired part-time clerk named Priya told him verbally it was fine as long as it stayed behind the fence line. He got that in a text message, screenshotted it, and thought that was the end of it. It wasn't the end of it. Twice a week in her white SUV, slowing at our side yard like she was cataloging evidence. She never knocked. The box behind our fence was 4. She just watched, and she wrote things down. The first letter came in April. Unauthorized structure violation. Side yard. Lot 42. No mention of medical necessity, because she never asked. Daniel called the office, explained everything calmly, attached my discharge papers. The clerk apologized and said she'd flag the file as resolved. Deborah never saw that email. In May, Deborah cornered Daniel at the mailbox kiosk. She told him special circumstances didn't exempt anyone from covenant compliance, that if she let one exception through, the whole neighborhood would fall apart. Daniel tried to explain the generator kept his wife alive. She said, "Then get a permit like everyone else." We got the permit. In business days. Standard for medical equipment installations. Daniel mailed a copy to the HOA office, kept the original, and thought the matter was finally closed. For 6 weeks, it was quiet. We started to believe Deborah had simply moved on. She hadn't moved on. The county permit covered zoning, not aesthetic compliance with HOA architectural guidelines, a separate clause she'd added to the bylaws herself the year before, requiring board approval for any exterior structure regardless of government permitting. Nobody had ever enforced that clause before us. At the June meeting, Deborah brought up Lot 42 by number, not by name, though everyone in the room knew exactly whose lot it was. She proposed a formal architectural review vote. 3 board members, all people she'd personally recruited, voted yes. The fourth, an older man named Walt, abstained, looking uneasy. Walt found me at the grocery store 2 days later. He said quietly that Deborah had pressured him for months to join the board, promising to overlook his own fence violation if he did. He looked ashamed, telling me, "She collects favors," he said, "and she collects grudges. Watch yourself." I didn't know yet how literally I'd need to watch myself. I was still learning to trust my own heartbeat again, still flinching at every unfamiliar sound my ventilator made. The idea that a neighbor's grudge could become a medical emergency hadn't occurred to me. It should have. In July, Deborah requested a home visit for documentation purposes. Daniel refused, citing my compromised immune system and doctor's orders limiting visitors. Deborah wrote in the HOA newsletter, without naming us, about residents who hide behind excuses to dodge community standards. Half the neighborhood knew exactly who she meant. Sophie came home from a friend's house crying that week. The friend's mother, a bored ally of Deborah's, had told her daughter our house was the one breaking the rules. 7-year-olds repeat things they don't understand. My daughter asked me, in the smallest voice, if we were bad people. I told her no. We weren't bad people. We were just tired people. And sometimes tired people become targets for others who need someone to blame. She nodded like she understood, though I don't think anyone truly understands cruelty at 7. I understood it a little better than I wanted to. By August, Deborah had assembled what she called an architectural compliance packet on our generator. Photos taken from the street, a printed copy of the original April letter, and a formal notice threatening a $200 per day fine if the structure wasn't relocated or removed within 30 days. Daniel brought the notice to my hospital follow-up appointment, hands shaking, and my cardiologist wrote a letter on hospital letterhead explaining, in plain clinical language, that interrupting my equipment's power supply could be fatal within minutes. We mailed it certified. Deborah signed for it herself. Nothing changed. Instead, something worse happened. Deborah began citing equal treatment under the covenant in every email, arguing that granting us an exception without a full board vote, which she controlled, would open the HOA to liability from other residents. She wasn't wrong about liability. She was simply weaponizing it. I started sleeping in shorter stretches, not from illness but from dread. Every time Deborah's white SUV rolled past our window, my monitor beeped a little faster, and I hated that a woman with a laminated binder had that kind of power over my nervous system. Daniel began documenting everything. Every letter, every email, every date and time Deborah's SUV idled outside our fence. He didn't tell me how much of it he was keeping. He said later he had a feeling, deep in his gut, that we'd need it someday, and someday soon. In late August, our neighbor Frank Ostrowski, a quiet retired National Guard engineer who lived 2 houses down, mentioned over the fence that Deborah had fined him twice for his utility trailer, despite it sitting on his own property behind a privacy screen. She doesn't like men who don't ask permission, he said, half joking. None of us knew yet that Frank would matter. He kept to himself, fixed generators for extra cash, and nodded politely at HOA meetings without ever speaking. I remember thinking he seemed like the kind of man storms passed over. I was wrong about that too. The 30-day deadline landed on a Thursday in September. Daniel had requested one more board hearing. In writing, citing the cardiologist's letter and the county permit. Deborah scheduled it for a night he couldn't attend. A night he'd already told her, in writing, that he worked a mandatory shift. He asked her to reschedule. She refused, saying the bylaws required 30-day notice for hearing changes. The same bylaws she'd bent twice already for her own convenience. I watched Daniel read that email at my bedside, his jaw tight, his hands very still, the way they get before he says something he can't take back. He didn't say it. And told me not to worry, that he'd find a way to be there. He asked his supervisor for one night off. His supervisor said no. They were already short-staffed. Daniel came home and told me he'd figure it out. The hearing happened without him. Priya, the clerk, later told us Deborah opened the meeting by reading our address aloud. Then said, Lot 42 has failed to comply despite repeated warnings, as if 120 days of medical letters and county permits had simply not existed. The board voted 3-1 to enforce the fine and issue a final relocation order. Move the generator off the property within 14 days or face fine escalation and a lien on the house. Walt voted no. Shook signing his own ballot. 14 days. The generator needed a stable, code-compliant location. That moving it wasn't a weekend project. That rushing an installation risked exactly the failure Deborah claimed to be preventing. I remember laughing, a short, bitter sound, at the idea that her rule might actually cause the danger. Daniel called an electrician for an emergency relocation quote. $6,000. 3 weeks minimum for permitting and inspection. Longer if the county office was backed up. We didn't have $6,000. We had a mortgage, medical bills, and one income while I couldn't work. I asked Daniel to let me handle Deborah myself. He didn't want to. Worried the stress would hurt me. But I'd spent a decade in ICUs talking down panicked families and furious surgeons. I thought I understood people like her. I thought reason would eventually land somewhere soft in a person. I called her directly. Voice pleasant, professional, like she was fielding a customer service complaint. I explained, calmly, what the machine did. What would happen to my heart rhythm within 4 minutes of power loss?
She said she was very sorry for my...
Then she said the sentence I'd replay for months afterward. But rules exist so we don't all have to negotiate our own exceptions. I asked her, quietly, if she understood that I could die. She said, I understand you feel that way. And the call ended 11 seconds later. I sat with the phone in my lap for a long time after that. Not crying. Not yet. Just recalibrating. The way you do in a code blue when the first plan fails and you have to find the second one fast. Before the numbers on the monitor stop meaning anything. Walt reached out again. This time by mail instead of grocery store whispers. Worried his phone might somehow be monitored. He wrote that Deborah had, months earlier, pushed through a bylaw amendment requiring unanimous board consent to remove a sitting president midterm, a rule with no precedent in similar HOAs nearby. He also mentioned something odd. Deborah always seemed to know things she shouldn't, like which residents had late mortgage payments or upcoming code inspections. Walt didn't know how. To cross her. The same fear a schoolyard learns before it understands why. Frank stopped by unannounced one evening, toolbox in hand, and offered to help relocate the generator himself for free, off the books, using his engineering background to get it code compliant faster than any contractor's calendar allowed. Daniel almost cried accepting the offer. I did cry. Quietly. In the next room. Frank worked 3 nights that week after his own job. Running conduit. Checking clearances. Doing everything by the book so Deborah would have no fresh violation to hang on us. He refused payment. Said only, I know what it's like when somebody with a clipboard thinks they're God. The relocation finished with 2 days to spare before the 14-day deadline. Daniel photographed everything, time-stamped, and emailed proof to the HOA office and to Deborah directly, copying Walt as a witness. For the first time in months, I let myself believe the worst might actually be over. It wasn't over. In an hour. Thanking Daniel for finally complying. Then added a line nobody expected. The new location, while compliant with the 14-day order, now sat 11 inches inside the setback line for accessory structures. A completely separate rule she'd never once mentioned before. 11 inches. With a tape measure. Hands shaking with something closer to disbelief than fear now. He was right. Over an obscure setback nobody enforced anywhere else in the neighborhood. A rule so minor most residents didn't know it existed. I finally understood. Sitting in my hospital bed at home, hooked to the machine that 11-inch line now threatened, that this had stopped being about rules a long time ago. Deborah wasn't protecting a covenant. She was protecting the feeling of being obeyed. And she would not let that feeling go easily. Walt confirmed it quietly later that week. He said Deborah had specifically pulled the setback ordinance from a county archive after Daniel's compliance email, searching for something, anything, that could keep the file open. She doesn't like losing, he told me. Losing makes her worse. Not better. That night my monitor beeped an irregular rhythm for the first time in weeks. Not from equipment failure, but from my own body responding to stress the way it always had. Honestly, before Deborah Voss ever learned my address. Daniel held my hand and said one thing. This isn't over. The next HOA newsletter arrived with a section titled Community Compliance Spotlight. No names, but unmistakably about us. It described a resident who had circumvented proper channels and endangered the integrity of the community by installing equipment without full board sign-off, painting Daniel's desperate, permitted, medically necessary work as reckless defiance. Neighbors started looking at us differently at the mailbox kiosk. A woman named Carol who used to wave stopped meeting my eyes. Another neighbor asked Daniel, half joking, half not, if it was true we'd built something illegal. Deborah never had to lie outright. She only had to leave things vague enough to poison. Sophie's teacher called about a change in her behavior at school. Quieter than usual, less willing to raise her hand. When I asked Sophie about it gently that night, she admitted kids had heard their parents talking about the family that broke the neighborhood rules. She asked if we could move. I told her we weren't going anywhere, that our house was ours, that sometimes people needed someone to be wrong so they could feel like they were right. She nodded slowly, the way kids do when they're filing something away to think about later. In the dark, alone, Daniel filed a formal appeal with the board over the 11-inch setback, requesting a variance given the documented medical emergency and the fact that no comparable enforcement had ever occurred elsewhere in Maple Ridge. Deborah scheduled the appeal hearing for the earliest available date the bylaws technically allowed, 45 days out. 45 days with an active fine clock running. $200 a day. climbing toward a number that would eventually threaten a lien on our home. Daniel did the math out loud once, then never said the number again. I watched him start setting aside grocery money instead of buying groceries. I called my cardiologist's office again, this time asking for something different. A formal medical necessity letter addressed not to the HOA, but to an attorney, because I'd finally accepted what Walt had been gently suggesting for weeks. We needed help outside the neighborhood's own closed little system. The attorney, a calm woman named Renata who specialized in disability accommodation law, listened to 20 minutes of our story without interrupting once. When I finished, she said quietly, "This isn't really an HOA dispute anymore. This is a Fair Housing Act issue, and HOAs lose these more often than they think." Renata explained that HOAs are legally required to provide reasonable accommodations for residents with documented disabilities, and that refusing to waive a minor setback rule for life-sustaining medical equipment could constitute exactly that kind of violation, one with real financial consequences for the association, not just for Deborah personally. We sent a formal accommodation request letter, drafted by Renata, citing federal law by name. Deborah's response came back within a day, colder and more careful than before, clearly run past someone with legal knowledge of her own. She denied nothing outright. She simply requested additional documentation she knew would take weeks. Weeks we didn't fully have. With the fine clock still running and my body still tethered to a machine now technically 11 inches into legal limbo. I remember thinking, staring at the ceiling one sleepless night, that Deborah had turned my survival into a paperwork war she assumed she'd win by attrition. She almost did. Kind of violence when you're sick. When every ounce of energy you have goes towards staying alive instead of fighting a woman with unlimited free time and a personal vendetta dressed up as civic duty. I felt myself growing tired in a way medicine couldn't fix. Then Priya, the HOA clerk, quietly reached out to Daniel outside of work hours, using her personal email. She said she couldn't keep watching this happen, that she'd been instructed by Deborah to slow walk our accommodation file specifically, a directive she'd never received for any other resident in 3 years working there. Priya forwarded screenshots, internal messages where Deborah wrote, in plain text, "Stall the medical exemption request until the fine balance is high enough that a lien becomes automatic." My hands went cold reading it. This wasn't a misunderstanding anymore. This was a plan, written down. In her own words, Renata reviewed the screenshots and went very quiet on the phone. The kind of quiet that meant something had shifted in her strategy. "This is no longer just an accommodation issue," she said finally. "This looks like retaliation and potential fraud. We're going to need everything Priya is willing to give us." Priya agreed to provide a sworn statement, but only after her own job was secure elsewhere. She'd already started quietly applying for other positions, afraid of what Deborah might do once she learned the truth. I understood that fear completely. I'd been living inside it for months. Meanwhile, the fine balance climbed past $4,000. Deborah sent a final notice before lien filing letter, formatted identically to the ones she'd sent other residents over trash cans and unapproved paint colors, as if my ventilator and someone's mailbox post belonged in the same category of offense. Daniel stopped sleeping most nights, doing double duty as caregiver and researcher, learning HOA lien law from law library websites at 3 a.m. between checking my oxygen saturation. I watched him disappear into exhaustion the same way I once had in my own ICU shifts, and it terrified me more than my own illness. One night he finally broke. Not loudly, just a long, quiet cry at the kitchen table when he thought I was asleep. I wasn't. To the doorway and told him the truth. We would get through this together, or we would fall apart together, but never apart. He wiped his face and said something I'll never forget. I keep thinking about how she's never once asked what your machine actually does. Not once. Fighting a life support system, and she's never asked a single question about the life it's supporting. That sentence stayed with me. It was the clearest description of Deborah Voss I'd heard yet. A woman who could look directly at a crisis and see only paperwork. Who mistook her own certainty for righteousness so completely that curiosity had become unnecessary, even threatening, to how she saw herself. Walt came by again, this time visibly frightened, saying Deborah had started asking board members pointed questions about loyalty after Priya missed 2 shifts. He believed Deborah suspected a leak. She's not stupid, Walt warned. If she finds out Priya talked, she'll come after her job. And maybe after you too harder. I asked Renata if we should wait, gather more evidence quietly before making any move. She said no. Life-sustaining medical equipment. Courts moved faster than most people expected, especially with documented retaliation in writing. We have enough right now, she said. Waiting only helps her. Not you. Renata filed for an emergency temporary restraining order, arguing imminent risk to life from the ongoing threat of forced generator removal, combined with the documented fine and lien retaliation scheme. The filing named the HOA and Deborah Voss individually, a detail Renata said mattered more than we yet understood. The court date came back fast. 11 days out. Faster than Deborah's own 45-day appeal hearing had ever promised us. For the first time since April, I felt something other than dread sitting in my chest. Felt almost like hope. Fragile and unfamiliar. Like a muscle I hadn't used in months. Deborah found out about the filing before the official notice even arrived, which told us exactly how deep her information network inside the community actually ran. She showed up at our door 2 days later, alone, no clipboard, wearing an expression I'd never seen on her before, uncertainty. She said she'd heard there was some confusion and wanted to clear the air before things escalated further. Daniel stood in the doorway, arms crossed, and told her politely that our attorney would be handling all further communication. Her jaw tightened. Door. You're really going to sue your own neighbors? She asked. Voice sharper now, the mask slipping just slightly at the edges. Daniel didn't answer the question. He simply closed the door, gently but firmly, and I heard her heels click back down our front walkway a moment later. Unusually fast. That night Frank texted Daniel a warning. Deborah had been seen going door to door on our street, asking neighbors to sign a petition supporting consistent enforcement of community standards, clearly aimed at building a defense narrative before the court hearing even started. 3 neighbors had already signed without asking questions. Carol, the neighbor who'd stopped waving, later told me privately she'd signed out of simple fear, not conviction, worried her own home's fence height would suddenly become Deborah's next project if she refused. She collects little debts, Carol admitted.
Then she cashes them.
I realized then how many people in Maple Ridge were quietly afraid of one woman with a laminated binder and a habit of remembering every small infraction she could later use as leverage. Fear, I understood now, had been Deborah's real infrastructure all along. stronger than any bylaw she'd ever written. For a few days, things went unnervingly quiet. No letters, no drive-bys, no newsletter spotlight columns. Daniel called it the calm before something, though neither of us said the word storm out loud. Superstitious in the exact way people become when they've been hurt too many times to relax. I used the quiet to rest. Really rest. For the first time in months. Sophie and I watched movies on the couch. Her small hand resting carefully on the tube taped to my arm. As if she'd learned exactly how to be close to me without hurting me. Children learn fast. Renata used the quiet differently. Deposing Priya formally. Reviewing county permit records. And requesting Deborah's HOA financial statements through Discovery. Standard procedure, she said. But something about her tone on the phone suggested she expected to find more than routine numbers in those spreadsheets. Walt mentioned, almost as an afterthought during a grocery store run, that Deborah had recently paid off her SUV lease early. In full, in cash. An unusual move for a woman who worked part-time at an insurance office and complained often about budget constraints at board meetings. I didn't think much of it then. Grief and fear had narrowed my focus to survival. To Sophie. To the sound of my own monitor at night. I didn't yet understand that Walt's small, offhand comment about a paid-off SUV would become one of the most important threads in this entire story. Frank kept a quiet eye on the generator setup each evening, checking connections without being asked. The way some men show love through maintenance instead of words. He never mentioned his own military service unless directly asked. But I noticed he always seemed to know exactly what to prepare for. One evening he mentioned, almost casually, that he kept a mobile generator truck stored at a friend's equipment yard nearby, leftover from disaster relief contract work years earlier. Old habit, he said, shrugging. Once you've seen a whole block lose power in a storm, you never stop thinking about backups. I thanked him and thought nothing more of it. Filing it away the way you file away small kindnesses from good neighbors. Not yet understanding that this particular detail, this particular truck, would matter more than almost anything else in the weeks still ahead of us. Daniel spent the quiet days preparing exhibits for the restraining order hearing, printing every letter, every fine notice, every screenshot Priya had provided, organizing them chronologically the way I once organized patient charts before rounds. Order, we both understood instinctively, was the only armor either of us had left. Renata warned us the calm might mean Deborah was building her own defense narrative, possibly preparing to argue the equipment truly violated safety codes. Regardless of medical necessity, a strategy meant to shift the story away from retaliation and back toward concerned community leader protecting shared standards. She was right to warn us. Deborah filed a countercomplaint with the county building inspector, alleging our relocated generator posed a fire hazard due to improper clearance, despite Frank's meticulous, code-compliant work. An inspector was scheduled to visit within 48 hours. Daniel called Frank immediately, panicked. Frank arrived within the hour, calm in a way that steadied both of us, and walked the entire installation with his own code book, confirming every measurement met or exceeded requirements. She's guessing, he said flatly. She doesn't actually know code. She's just hoping we don't either. The quiet was officially over. I lay in bed that night listening to my ventilator's steady mechanical breath, thinking that Deborah had just made her first truly desperate move, the kind people make when they sense somewhere underneath their own certainty that the ground is finally starting to shift beneath them. The inspector arrived on schedule, professional and unhurried, walking the perimeter of the generator with a tablet, checking clearances against county code line by line. Frank stood beside him, answering technical questions calmly. Deborah watched from the sidewalk, arms crossed, clearly expecting a different outcome than the one now unfolding. The inspector found no violation. 0. Almost apologetically, that the installation actually exceeded minimum clearance requirements by several inches, a detail Frank had insisted on specifically to prevent exactly this kind of complaint. Deborah's face, Daniel told me later, had gone perfectly, unmistakably still. She tried one more angle on the spot, asking the inspector about noise ordinance compliance, a category that didn't technically fall under his jurisdiction at all. He told her, politely, that she'd need to file a separate complaint through an entirely different county department. She thanked him too quickly and left. That evening, Renata called with results from the financial discovery request. Deborah's HOA-controlled reserve fund, meant for community maintenance, showed 3 unexplained transfers over the past year, each just under the $10,000 threshold that would have required a formal board vote to authorize under the association's own bylaws. Renata explained the pattern carefully. Structuring transactions to stay under a reporting threshold was a common tactic in embezzlement cases, one courts and prosecutors recognized immediately. I'm not saying that's what happened, she said, but I am saying someone is going to have to explain these numbers eventually. Walt's earlier comment about the paid-off SUV suddenly felt less like small talk and more like a loose thread in a much larger pattern. Daniel and I sat at the kitchen table that night, staring at printed bank statement excerpts, feeling something shift from defense into something closer to investigation. Priya, still quietly gathering courage, admitted during her deposition that Deborah had once asked her to misplace a maintenance invoice that conflicted with a reimbursement Deborah had already submitted for the same work. Priya refused at the time, uneasy, but had never known who to tell. Renata began building 2 parallel arguments now. The accommodation and retaliation claim protecting my equipment, and a separate financial irregularity thread that, while not our primary case, could not legally be ignored once discovered through the discovery process. Sometimes, she said, one door opens onto another door nobody expected. Deborah, unaware of how much we now knew, escalated instead of retreating, a pattern Walt had warned us about from the very beginning. She sent a community-wide email announcing an emergency board meeting to address false allegations being spread by certain residents, clearly aimed at painting us as the aggressors. The meeting drew a bigger crowd than usual. Nearly 40 residents packed into the small clubhouse room, drawn by curiosity and rumor in equal measure. Deborah stood at the front, composed, rehearsed, describing a campaign of harassment against her leadership by residents unwilling to follow basic community guidelines. She never said our names directly, technically, but every head in the room turned toward us anyway when she spoke about certain residents with expensive lawyers trying to bully a volunteer board. I sat in my wheelchair near the back, oxygen line visible, and let the room draw its own conclusions. Carol stood up unexpectedly, voice shaking slightly, and said she wanted to ask a simple question. Was it true that Deborah had specifically instructed the office to delay a medical accommodation request? The room went silent in a way that felt different from before. Sharper, more attentive. Deborah's composure cracked for just a moment. A flicker Daniel caught on video from his phone in his jacket pocket. Before she recovered and said the question was based on a mischaracterization of internal staffing decisions. It was the first time I'd seen her visibly choose her words instead of simply stating them. Walt, sitting near the front, finally spoke up for the first time in 18 months of silent board membership, saying quietly but clearly that he'd voted no on the original enforcement action and had concerns about how the process had been handled from the very beginning. Deborah's eyes cut toward him sharply. The meeting ended without resolution. Technically, but something had shifted in the room's collective posture. People who once avoided our eyes now approached Daniel afterward, quietly, some apologizing for signing Deborah's petition, admitting they hadn't understood the full situation, only the fear of being her next target. 2 more neighbors reached out to Priya privately over the following days, describing their own small, previously unspoken run-ins with Deborah, inflated fines, selectively enforced rules, veiled threats about how quickly things could change for anyone who challenged her decisions publicly. Pattern, once visible, became impossible to unsee. Renata compiled these new statements alongside Priya's, building what she called a pattern of retaliatory enforcement argument, strengthening our original case significantly. Judges care about isolated incidents, she explained, but they care even more about patterns that show intent, not just individual bad decisions. Deborah, sensing the tide turning even if she couldn't yet name why, doubled down publicly instead of pulling back. A choice Walt said matched everything he'd learned about her over the past year and a half. She doesn't retreat, he told us. She only ever escalates. It's the only gear she has. She filed a formal complaint against Carol with the board, alleging Carol had violated meeting decorum rules by publicly slandering a sitting HOA president. A charge so clearly retaliatory that even one of Deborah's own loyal board members privately questioned it. According to Priya's continued quiet updates, Carol, rattled but resolute, called Renata directly, and Renata added her complaint to the growing pattern file without hesitation. Every time she does this, Renata told us on a call that night, she hands us another exhibit. I almost feel like I should send her a thank you card. I laughed for the first time in weeks at that comment. A real laugh. The kind that catches you off guard in the middle of exhaustion. Daniel looked at me like I'd handed him something precious, and I realized how long it had been since either of us had found room for anything like joy. The fine balance on our account had, by this point, exceeded $7,000. Still technically active despite the pending litigation. A detail Renata said the judge would find particularly relevant, given everything else now on record. Deborah had not paused the fines even once during the entire dispute. Frank mentioned, during one of his evening check-ins on the generator, that he'd once had a run-in with Deborah himself. Years earlier, over his utility trailer, a story he'd shared only in fragments before. This time, sensing the moment mattered, he told the whole thing, start to finish. Deborah had fined him for the trailer despite it sitting fully behind his privacy fence, invisible from the street entirely. When Frank challenged the fine, providing photos proving it wasn't visible, Deborah reportedly told him, I know it's there. That's enough. The fine stood. He paid it rather than fight. I should have fought it back then, Frank admitted quietly. But I'd just gotten back from a deployment and I didn't have the fight left in me. I've regretted that ever since. He looked at Daniel and me for a long moment. "I'm not making that mistake again. Not this time." That sentence settled something in the air between us. An unspoken alliance forming out of years of small, separate injustices finally converging into one larger, undeniable pattern. Deborah Voss. We were all beginning to understand. Hadn't created isolated conflicts. She'd built a small, quiet kingdom out of accumulated fear. The restraining order hearing arrived on a gray Thursday morning, and Daniel wheeled me into the courthouse myself. Oxygen tank secured to the side of my chair. Monitor readouts visible on my wrist. Renata had specifically asked that I attend in person, if my health allowed. My health allowed it. Deborah arrived with her own attorney, a sharp-suited man named Mr. Callahan, who specialized, according to Renata's quick research, in defending small associations against exactly this kind of claim. He looked confident walking in. That confidence, I noticed, seemed to dim slightly the moment he saw my wheelchair and oxygen line. The judge, a measured woman named Judge Alvarez, reviewed the filed exhibits before either side spoke a word. The medical letters, the county permit, the fine notices, Priya's sworn statement, and the internal messages instructing staff to stall the medical exemption request. Her expression remained carefully neutral throughout. Renata argued first, calmly walking through the timeline. Documented medical necessity, a granted county permit, a still enforced HOA fine despite repeated accommodation requests, and internal communications proving deliberate delay tactics designed specifically to force financial harm onto a resident with a documented, potentially fatal medical condition. Mr. That the HOA had legitimate authority to enforce its own architectural guidelines regardless of medical circumstances, and that the 11-inch setback violation remained factually accurate and unresolved. He avoided mentioning the internal messages entirely, hoping, seemed, the judge might overlook their significance. She did not overlook it. Directly, for Deborah to explain the phrase, stall the medical exemption request until the fine balance is high enough that a lien becomes automatic. Reading it aloud slowly, letting each word sit in the silent courtroom before waiting for an answer. Deborah's face, for the first time in this entire ordeal, showed something other than practiced composure. She said the message had been taken out of context, that she'd meant only to ensure proper documentation procedures were followed before any accommodation was formally approved. Judge Alvarez did not look convinced.
The judge said evenly, "I've read a great many HOA disputes in this courtroom. I have never once seen proper documentation procedures phrased as a strategy to maximize financial penalty before a lien filing." A few quiet sounds rippled through the gallery behind us, something between a gasp and a laugh.
The judge granted the temporary restraining order without hesitation, barring the HOA from enforcing the setback fine or pursuing any lien action against our property pending a full hearing on the accommodation claim. She also ordered all further fines suspended immediately, effective that same afternoon. No exceptions. Deborah left the courthouse without a word to us, walking fast toward the parking lot. Mr. Callahan trailing a few steps behind, trying to keep pace. Daniel squeezed my hand as we watched her go. For the first time in months, the machine keeping me alive felt, briefly, undisputed. The relief lasted exactly 6 days. On the 7th, a new letter arrived, not from the HOA this time, but from a different address entirely. A private attorney representing several unnamed board members, alleging that Priya's disclosure of internal communications violated her employment confidentiality agreement and threatening legal action against her personally. Priya called Daniel in tears, terrified she was about to lose everything for simply telling the truth. Renata immediately intervened, reminding the opposing attorney by formal letter that whistleblower protections applied clearly in cases involving documented retaliation against a resident with a federally protected disability. The threat quietly disappeared within days, but the message had been sent and received exactly as Deborah intended, a warning to anyone else considering coming forward. Walt told us privately he'd received a similarly worded and signed note in his own mailbox, warning vaguely about consequences for board members who breach fiduciary loyalty. He didn't sleep well that week. I began to understand that Deborah wasn't simply losing a legal battle. She was, in her own mind, defending something much larger. The entire structure of fear she'd spent 18 months building, one small fine and one quiet threat at a time, brick by careful, deliberate brick. Renata warned us the financial discovery thread was growing more serious. The 3 suspiciously structured transfers had ballooned, upon deeper review, into 11 separate transactions over 2 years, all just under reporting thresholds, totaling nearly $42,000 diverted from the HOA's shared maintenance and reserve funds. She recommended reporting the financial pattern formally to the district attorney's consumer fraud unit, separate from our own civil case, since embezzlement from a nonprofit association fell under criminal, not civil, jurisdiction. "This isn't about us anymore," Renata said carefully.
This is about protecting.
We agonized over that decision for 2 full days. Part of me worried it would look like retaliation of our own, an escalation Deborah could twist into another narrative about victimized leadership under attack. Daniel reminded me, gently, that silence had never once protected us from her. Only truth had. We authorized Renata to forward the financial documentation to the district attorney's office. She warned us it might take weeks, even months, before any formal action emerged. Criminal investigations moving at their own careful pace regardless of how urgently the underlying harm had already been felt by real people. In the meantime, Deborah, apparently unaware of the DA referral, pivoted her public strategy entirely. She began framing the restraining order loss not as a legal defeat, but as proof of government overreach into community self-governance. A talking point that resonated with a small but vocal faction of residents. A handful of longtime homeowners, frustrated by years of minor rule violations from other neighbors, rallied briefly around her, seeing in Deborah not a bully but a last defender of standards against encroaching chaos. It unsettled me how easily fear of disorder could be repackaged as principled leadership. Frank watched this unfold with quiet disgust, telling Daniel one evening that he'd seen this exact pattern before in smaller forms. Communities rallying around the loudest voice in the room simply because loud voices feel, mistakenly, like strength. Fear dressed as leadership, he said, is still just fear. 3 weeks after the restraining order, Deborah made the move that finally, unmistakably, crossed every remaining line. Late on a Tuesday night, our power went out, not just to the generator, but to the entire house. Ventilator alarm screaming into the dark exactly as it had that very first terrifying night. Daniel ran outside in his socks, phone flashlight cutting through darkness, and found the main utility disconnect switch at the street junction box physically thrown to off. a switch technically accessible only to utility workers or, we would later learn, someone with insider knowledge of exactly where to find it. My backup battery held for 11 minutes before the ventilator's secondary alarm kicked in, a sound I will hear in my nightmares for the rest of my life, mechanical and relentless, counting down toward a silence none of us were ready to face on a quiet residential street. Frank, roused by his own police scanner app pinging a nearby outage report, was at our fence within 4 minutes. Generator truck engine already turning over in his driveway before Daniel had even finished dialing 911. He'd apparently kept it fueled and ready ever since our very first conversation about it. He backed the truck down our narrow street, hazards flashing, and ran heavy-gauge cable directly into our home's emergency transfer switch, a connection he'd insisted on installing weeks earlier just in case. A phrase that now felt less like caution and more like quiet, protective foresight. Power surged back into the ventilator with 8 minutes to spare before the deep reserve battery would have failed completely. I felt the machine's rhythm steady beneath me, and for the first time all night, I let myself breathe the way the machine was breathing for me. Slow, deliberate, alive. Police arrived shortly after, called by 3 separate neighbors who'd heard the commotion. The responding officer found the disconnect switch, clearly manually thrown, and noted it in his report as a possible act of vandalism or sabotage, pending further investigation into who had access to that specific junction box. Only 3 keys existed for that particular utility access panel, according to the county records officer contacted the next morning. 2 held by certified utility workers, and 1 held by the HOA president, granted years earlier for emergency landscaping access during a since-forgotten irrigation project. Deborah's key landed in the room like something physical, a weight settling over all of us at once. Daniel's hands shook holding his phone as he read the utility company's confirmation email aloud, his voice cracking slightly on the final sentence. Access log shows Lot 42 junction, opened at 1:47 a.m. Renata filed for an emergency criminal referral within hours, this time not for embezzlement, but for what county prosecutors would eventually classify as reckless endangerment, given the documented, foreseeable medical risk to a resident whose life-sustaining equipment depended entirely on that specific power connection. Police obtained a warrant for the junction box access logs directly from the utility company, bypassing the HOA entirely, confirming the exact timestamp and the exact key code used. Deborah's key code. Not a maintenance worker's code. Hers, registered under her own full legal name. Word spread through Maple Ridge fast, faster than any newsletter Deborah had ever printed. Neighbors who'd once quietly signed her petitions began quietly reaching out to Priya, to Carol, to Renata's office directly, saying they'd seen Deborah's SUV parked near the junction box that same night. Engine running. One neighbor, a night shift nurse herself named Bianca, had photographed the SUV from her own porch camera around 1:40 a.m., annoyed at the idling engine noise outside her window, never imagining the timestamp would later matter to anyone beyond her own minor complaint about neighborhood noise. Renata submitted Bianca's footage alongside the utility access logs, building what she now called an airtight timeline. Deborah's vehicle at the scene, her personal access code used on the junction box, and 11 minutes of documented, life-threatening power lost to a home she'd fought for months to punish. Deborah's own attorney, Mr. Callahan, reportedly requested an emergency meeting with her the next morning, according to a rumor that reached us through Priya, who'd heard it secondhand from someone at the county clerk's office. He was said to be furious she hadn't disclosed the disconnect switch access beforehand. Deborah herself went silent publicly for the first time in the entire 18-month ordeal. No newsletter entry, no drive-by, no emergency board meeting announcement. Just silence. A silence Walt described as the loudest thing she's done since she took office. Heavy with something that finally resembled fear instead of control. I spent the days after the outage in a strange, suspended state, physically stable but emotionally raw in a way even ICU nursing hadn't fully prepared me for. Sophie asked why Mommy's machine had gone quiet that night, and I struggled to explain cruelty to a child in words gentle enough for her. I told her some grown-ups get so used to being obeyed that they forget other people are real, with real feelings, real families, real hearts that need real machines. She thought about that for a long moment, then said, "That sounds like a scary way to be a grown-up." I agreed completely. Frank installed a secondary, independent backup line the following week. One that bypassed the HOA's shared junction infrastructure entirely. Running instead through a dedicated meter he'd helped Daniel arrange directly with the utility company. "Nobody touches this line but us," he said. "Not the HOA." Renata told us the district attorney's office had officially opened 2 separate files now. The reckless endangerment case tied to the power outage,
and the embezzlement referral from weeks earlier. Now moving faster given the sudden public attention the outage incident had generated across local news outlets.
A local reporter named Miguel Reyes reached out to Renata's office after hearing about the courthouse hearing from a public records request, asking to interview us for a story on HOA overreach and medical accommodation disputes. I hesitated at first, exhausted, but Daniel encouraged me gently. "Let people see the truth," he said. I agreed to a short interview from my living room, ventilator visible in the background, deliberately unhidden. I wanted people to see exactly what Deborah had spent months trying to erase behind paperwork and property lines. A real person, breathing with the help of a machine she'd tried to silence twice. The story ran 2 days later under the headline, "HOA President's Power Struggle Nearly Cost a Neighbor Her Life." It spread faster than any of us expected. Shared widely across local social media groups, picked up by 2 other regional outlets within 48 hours of the original publication. Deborah's name appeared publicly for the first time, no longer shielded by vague newsletter language about certain residents or community standards. Just her name, her title, and a timeline of documented actions that no longer required anyone's interpretation to understand exactly what had happened, and to whom. The public response was swift and, for the first time in this entire ordeal, entirely in our favor. Strangers online, other HOA residents from unrelated neighborhoods, shared their own stories of overreach, painting a broader picture of how easily small positions of authority could curdle into something genuinely dangerous. Deborah's employer, the insurance office where she worked part-time, released a brief statement distancing itself from her personal community involvement, a corporate way of saying, without saying, that they didn't want their name anywhere near the growing controversy now surrounding her online. 3 board members resigned within the week, including 2 who had originally voted alongside Deborah on the setback enforcement action. One of them, in her resignation letter, admitted privately to Priya that she'd never fully agreed with the enforcement, but had been too afraid of Deborah's retaliation to vote otherwise. Walt did not resign. Called for a special emergency meeting under the HOA's own bylaws, citing a rarely used clause allowing removal of a board president for documented conduct detrimental to resident safety and association integrity, a clause, ironically, Deborah herself had once cited against other residents. Deborah requested a delay, citing due process concerns, a request the remaining board members denied unanimously, a first in 18 months of near-total deference to whatever Deborah requested. Something had fundamentally shifted in that room, a fear finally breaking apart under the weight of undeniable evidence. The meeting was scheduled for the following Saturday, open to all residents, a detail Walt insisted on specifically. She built her power in closed rooms, he told Daniel. She's going to lose it in an open one, in front of everyone she ever tried to intimidate into silence. In the days leading up to the meeting, Deborah made one final, desperate attempt to control the narrative, mailing a personal letter to every household in Maple Ridge, describing herself as a dedicated volunteer, targeted by a coordinated smear campaign from residents unwilling to respect community leadership and shared standards. The letter backfired almost immediately. Several residents who'd received nearly identical language in past fine notices recognized the same manipulative tone Deborah had once used against them personally, now redirected toward garnering sympathy for herself. Carol told me she'd never seen irony land so precisely or so publicly. Renata received a call from Mr. Callahan requesting a private settlement conversation before the emergency meeting, hoping to resolve our civil case quietly, quickly, away from further public attention. Renata listened, then told him plainly that our case was no longer the only one that mattered here. There's a criminal referral now, she reminded him. That's not something my clients can simply agree to make disappear, even if they wanted to. Mr. Callahan reportedly went quiet on the other end of the line for a long moment before ending the call without further comment. Deborah, we later learned from Priya, had begun quietly withdrawing funds from a personal savings account, a detail that would only make sense weeks later once the full financial picture emerged. At the time, it simply read as one more strange, unexplained detail in an already strange, unraveling story. The night before the emergency meeting, I lay awake listening to my ventilator's steady rhythm, thinking not about anger anymore, but about something closer to exhausted anticipation. 18 months of fear had built toward this single Saturday morning, and some quiet part of me finally believed it might actually end. Saturday arrived gray and cool, the clubhouse parking lot filling faster than anyone had seen in years, cars lining both sides of the street. Daniel wheeled me in early, oxygen tank secured, and found the room already crowded with neighbors who'd never once attended an HOA meeting before that day. Frank sat near the back, arms crossed, quietly present the way he'd been throughout this entire ordeal, steady and unassuming until the exact moment steadiness alone wasn't enough. Priya sat near Renata, visibly nervous but resolute, having agreed to speak publicly for the first time about everything she'd witnessed. Walt opened the meeting, voice steadier than I'd ever heard it, reading the removal clause aloud in full before summarizing the documented pattern: medical fine enforcement despite accommodation requests, internal messages instructing deliberate delay, financial irregularities under DA review, and the unauthorized junction box access during the power outage. Deborah sat at the front table, composed on the surface but visibly rigid, hands folded tightly enough that her knuckles had gone pale. She requested to speak first, before any vote, and the room, out of some lingering habit of deference, allowed it, though the silence that followed felt different now. She spoke for nearly 10 minutes, describing her tenure as one of sacrifice and thankless service, insisting the power outage had been a misunderstanding involving landscaping equipment testing, a claim that directly contradicted the utility company's own access logs already entered into the public record weeks earlier. A murmur rippled through the crowd, disbelief settling visibly across dozens of faces at once. Bianca, the night shift nurse whose porch camera had captured Deborah's idling SUV, stood up unprompted and asked, evenly, why landscaping equipment testing required disabling a residential home's entire main power connection at 1:47 a.m. Deborah had no answer prepared for that specific question, and the silence that followed stretched long enough to become its own kind of answer. She glanced toward Mr. Callahan, seated near the door, but he offered nothing. No whispered guidance. No rescue. He simply looked down at his own folder. Renata rose next, calm and precise, walking the room through the full documented timeline one final time, not with anger, but with the measured clarity of someone who had built an airtight case brick by careful brick over 18 exhausting months, exactly the way Deborah herself had once built her power. When Renata finished, she said one final sentence that seemed to land on every person in that room at once. This isn't a dispute about a generator anymore. This is a story about what happens when someone forgets that rules exist to protect people, not to punish them for surviving. The room was completely silent for a long moment afterward, the kind of silence that feels heavier than any applause could have. Then Carol stood, voice trembling but clear, and said she wanted to formally retract her earlier petition signature, admitting she'd signed out of fear, not genuine belief. One by one, other residents stood to say similar things, small confessions of fear-driven compliance stacking quietly on top of each other, each one chipping away further at the image Deborah had spent 18 months carefully constructing. She sat motionless through all of it, staring at the table in front of her. Walt finally called for the vote on removal, reading the clause's exact language aloud once more for the official record. Hands rose slowly at first, then steadily, then almost unanimously across the crowded room. Residents who'd once been too afraid to challenge her now standing openly, visibly, together. The final count wasn't close. Deborah Voss was removed as HOA president, effective immediately, by an overwhelming majority vote of the residents present that day. She sat frozen at the front table for several long seconds afterward, as if the room's silence had physically pinned her in place. She stood eventually, gathered her binder with hands that were no longer entirely steady, and walked toward the exit without a word to anyone. Nobody stopped her. The room's collective fear, the very thing that had kept her power intact for so long, had simply, finally, dissolved. Outside the clubhouse, reporters who'd caught wind of the meeting waited near the parking lot, drawn by the earlier news coverage. Deborah walked past them quickly, declining comment, climbing into the same white SUV that had once idled so confidently outside our fence, engine roaring away far faster than usual. Inside, the room slowly exhaled into something between disbelief and quiet celebration. Neighbors hugging, some crying, Priya finally allowing herself visible relief after months of quiet fear about her own job security. Frank caught my eye across the room and gave a small, satisfied nod. Nothing more needed between us. Walt approached our chairs afterward, apologizing again for his earlier silence, though I told him honestly that his final courage mattered more than any earlier hesitation ever could. It's never too late to stop being afraid, I told him. You proved that today, in front of everyone. That evening, at home, I sat beside my ventilator and simply listened to it breathe with me, no longer bracing for the next drive-by, the next letter, the next carefully worded threat disguised as civic duty. Sophie curled up beside my wheelchair and asked if the scary grown-up was really gone. I told her yes, mostly gone, though the criminal cases would still take time to fully resolve. She thought about that for a moment, then said something unexpectedly wise for a 7-year-old. Good. Now maybe the neighborhood can stop being scared of one person and just be a neighborhood again. 2 weeks later, the district attorney's office formally charged Deborah Voss with reckless endangerment related to the power outage, and separately, with embezzlement charges tied to the $42,000 in structured HOA fund transfers uncovered during Renata's original financial discovery request months earlier. The embezzlement investigation revealed something none of us had anticipated. Deborah had used a significant portion of the diverted funds to cover her own
son's private medical bills 2 years earlier. Costly, undisclosed treatment for a chronic illness she'd never once mentioned to anyone in the community.
It was, in its own strange way, the story's final twist, one that reframed everything without excusing any of it. Deborah hadn't simply been cruel for cruelty's sake. She'd been quietly desperate once herself, and rather than ask for help, she'd chosen control, secrecy, and eventually cruelty toward someone else's desperation instead. I felt something complicated reading that detail in the news report. Not forgiveness exactly, but a kind of sad recognition. Fear, left unspoken long enough, curdles into something ugly in almost anyone. Deborah had simply had more opportunity than most to let that ugliness harden into policy, into power, into harm. Renata reminded us gently that understanding someone's pain didn't erase the damage they'd caused. She had a choice, Renata said. Plenty of scared people ask for help instead of building a system to punish others for their own fear. That choice is what she'll actually be held accountable for. Our civil case settled shortly after the criminal charges were filed. The HOA's insurance covering damages related to the medical accommodation violation. The fine balance formally erased. And a new, binding accommodation policy adopted by the association's remaining board, drafted with Renata's direct input to prevent this from ever happening again. Priya was offered, and accepted, a permanent full-time position managing HOA operations under the new interim board, this time with formal whistleblower protections written directly into her contract. Something Walt insisted on personally, unwilling to let another employee ever feel as trapped as she once had. Frank waved off every attempt we made to properly repay him, eventually accepting only a standing invitation to Sunday dinners, which became, over the following months, a genuine, easy friendship neither of us had expected to find growing out of something that began with a screaming ventilator alarm at 2 a.m. Carol and I became close as well, an unlikely friendship forged from her honest, public regret and my own slow willingness to extend grace to someone who had, eventually, chosen courage over continued fear. She still apologizes sometimes, unprompted. I always tell her the apology mattered, and it's enough now, Walt was elected interim HOA president by unanimous vote the following month, a position he accepted reluctantly, saying only that he wanted to make sure Maple Ridge never again became a place where fear could quietly calcify into policy the way it had under Deborah's careful, patient control. Deborah's trial began 4 months later, delayed slightly by pretrial motions from a new attorney after Mr. Callahan formally withdrew from her case, citing, according to court filings, irreconcilable differences regarding case strategy. A polite legal phrase for something Renata suspected ran much deeper than simple disagreement. I testified on the second day, describing in plain, clinical language exactly what happens to a compromised heart when ventilator support fails. The specific timeline, the specific danger, the specific 11 minutes that separated ordinary Tuesday night from something the coroner's report might have instead described. Deborah sat at the defense table throughout my testimony. Eyes lowered, hands folded in the exact same rigid posture I remembered from the emergency meeting months earlier. She did not look at me once. Not during my testimony. Not during the cross-examination. Not during the recess that followed immediately after. The prosecution presented the utility access logs, Bianca's time-stamped porch footage, and Priya's internal message screenshots in careful, methodical sequence, building the same airtight timeline Renata had constructed months earlier, now laid out for a jury instead of a judge alone in a quiet courtroom. Deborah's attorney argued diminished culpability, citing her own son's medical crisis 2 years earlier as evidence of a woman under sustained, unaddressed personal stress, not excusing the outage, but hoping to frame it as an isolated lapse rather than a calculated pattern of deliberate, sustained cruelty. The prosecution countered simply, methodically, reminding the jury that the outage hadn't been an isolated lapse at all, but the culmination of 18 months, of documented fines, delayed accommodations, internal messages proving intent, and a final, deliberate act using a key issued for an entirely unrelated purpose. The jury deliberated for just under 6 hours. When they returned, the courtroom fell into the same heavy, expectant silence I remembered from the emergency meeting months earlier, a silence that seemed to follow Deborah Voss now wherever consequences finally caught up with her carefully constructed authority. Guilty on the reckless endangerment charge. Guilty on the embezzlement charges. The judge, the same measured woman who'd granted our original restraining order months earlier, scheduled sentencing for 6 weeks later, citing the need for a full financial restitution assessment before determining an appropriate final sentence. Deborah showed no visible reaction to the verdict, sitting perfectly still, the same rigid composure she'd maintained throughout the entire 18-month ordeal now finally, publicly, unmistakably cracking at its foundation, even if her face refused to show the world exactly how far that crack had actually spread. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered again, and this time Daniel wheeled me directly toward them instead of away, wanting, for once, to speak our own story in our own words rather than let it exist only in headlines and secondhand summaries filtered through other people's careful phrasing. I don't feel triumphant, I told them honestly, my voice steady despite the tube still running beneath my nose. I feel relieved. Finally chose to see a person instead of a paperwork problem. That's really all any of us ever wanted from the beginning. Sentencing came 6 weeks later, as scheduled. Deborah received 18 months in county jail for reckless endangerment, running concurrently with a 3-year probation sentence for embezzlement, alongside a court-ordered restitution payment plan requiring full repayment of the $42,000 diverted from the HOA's shared reserve funds. The judge, before delivering the final sentence, addressed Deborah directly for a long moment, saying that positions of small community authority carried real consequences precisely because they were so easily abused by people who mistook obedience for respect and control for genuine leadership. Deborah did not respond. I watched from my wheelchair as two officers led her from the courtroom. No longer the composed, clipboard-wielding figure who'd once idled outside our fence twice a week, cataloging violations with quiet, patient cruelty. Just a tired, defeated woman finally facing the full weight of choices she'd made alone. Renata told us afterward that Deborah's own son, now a teenager, had reportedly stopped speaking to her entirely sometime during the trial, unable to reconcile the mother who'd once fought fiercely for his medical care with the woman who just as fiercely denied that same basic mercy to someone else's family. I thought about that detail for a long time afterward, turning it over slowly, the way you turn over any story that refuses to resolve into simple, comfortable categories of villain and victim. Deborah had caused real, lasting harm. She had also, once, loved someone enough to break her own rules for them. Both things were true at once. And I found, somewhat to my own surprise, that I didn't need to resolve that contradiction into something simpler than it actually was. Some people cause harm not because they lack the capacity for love, but because they never learned how to extend it beyond their own walls. Maple Ridge Estates changed slowly over the following months. Not perfectly, not instantly, but genuinely. Walt's interim board adopted a formal accommodation policy, a transparent fine appeal process, and term limits for the HOA presidency. Small structural changes designed specifically to prevent any single person from accumulating that kind of unchecked fear-based power again. Priya thrived in her new role. Residents told me later, warm and fair in a way the office hadn't been in years, handling small disputes with patience instead of leverage, understanding intimately, from her own experience, exactly how much damage a badge of small authority could do in careless or cruel hands. Frank remained exactly who he'd always been throughout this entire ordeal. Quiet, steady, endlessly generous with his time and skill. Though the neighborhood now understood him differently. No longer just the quiet man with the trailer, but the man who'd shown up in the dark when it mattered most. Carol organized a small neighborhood gathering that spring. The first genuinely warm community event Maple Ridge had seen in years, and I attended in my wheelchair, oxygen tank secured, no longer hiding my machine behind a fence line or a legal argument, just present, simply alive, among neighbors who finally saw me clearly. Sophie played in the cul-de-sac that afternoon with children whose parents had once signed petitions against us. All of it forgiven now, or at least set gently aside. The particular resilience of childhood finding its way back towards simple, easy friendship faster than any of the adults around them ever quite managed. My own recovery continued slowly, unevenly, the way real recoveries usually do. Some days stronger, some days frightening. The machine beside my bed still a constant. Quiet companion I'd stopped resenting somewhere in the middle of this entire long, exhausting fight for the basic right to keep breathing in peace. I think often about that first terrifying night. The alarm screaming into darkness. Daniel running outside in his socks. Deborah watching calmly from her porch as if my survival were simply an inconvenient rule violation waiting to be corrected. I think about how close fear came to becoming permanent silence. I think, too, about Frank's headlights cutting through that darkness. About heavy cable running steady power back into a machine that had, for 11 unbearable minutes, been fighting against nothing but empty air. Sometimes the difference between tragedy and survival really is exactly that small, exactly that specific, exactly that close. Renata still checks in occasionally. Months later, less as our attorney now and more as something closer to a friend who happened to help save my life through patient, methodical legal work instead of any dramatic courtroom speech. The paperwork mattered, she told me once.
But so did refuse.
Walt stepped down from the HOA presidency eventually, once the new policies were firmly established, handing leadership to a younger resident with genuine community trust and none of Deborah's appetite for quiet, accumulated control. He still checks on Frank's generator setup occasionally, old habits proving hard to fully release. Deborah's house sold roughly 8 months after her sentencing, her family relocating quietly to be closer to relatives elsewhere. The white SUV finally, permanently gone from the streets of Maple Ridge, no longer idling outside anyone's fence, cataloging violations that were never really about violations at all. I don't know exactly what happened to her afterward, beyond the basic facts of probation and restitution, and some part of me has made careful, deliberate peace with not needing to know. Her story continued somewhere beyond the edges of mine, and mine, thankfully, finally continued well beyond the edges of hers. What I carry forward instead is something simpler, something Frank said to me once, quietly, while checking cable connections in our side yard on an ordinary Tuesday evening, months after everything had finally, truly settled. Power, he said, only really means something when you choose how you use it. I think about that often now, watching my daughter grow steadily, healthily, in a neighborhood that finally feels safe again, watching my own heart continue its slow, imperfect recovery beneath a machine that never once stopped fighting for me, even when a woman with a laminated binder tried to make it stop. The full financial restitution was completed 11 months after sentencing. The HOA's reserve fund fully repaid. According to Walt's final community newsletter under his leadership, a newsletter notably free of vague, accusatory language about certain residents, replaced instead by genuine updates about shared maintenance projects and community events. Priya told me once, near the end of that first difficult year, that she sometimes still flinched slightly whenever a white SUV drove down the street, an old fear taking its time fully releasing its grip. I understood that completely. My own ventilator alarm still occasionally sends my pulse racing. Even on ordinary nights, trauma, I've learned, doesn't disappear simply because justice eventually arrives. Softens, slowly, unevenly, replaced gradually by new, steadier memories. Frank's truck headlights in the driveway, Carol's honest apology, Walt's trembling but determined vote, Renata's calm, methodical voice explaining exactly why the truth, eventually, always mattered more than fear. Sophie rarely mentions the scary grown-up anymore, though occasionally, at bedtime, she still asks quietly whether rules are supposed to help people or hurt them. I tell her the truth every time. Good rules protect people, and the moment a rule starts hurting someone instead, it's the rule that needs to change. Daniel and I talk sometimes, late at night, about how close we came to losing everything over 11 minutes and a woman's quiet, patient cruelty. We don't dwell there long. Mostly we talk instead about ordinary things now. Groceries, Sophie's school project, the small, precious boredom we once thought we'd lost forever. I returned, eventually, to part-time nursing work myself, consulting remotely with a home hospice organization, helping other families navigate exactly the kind of medical equipment disputes that once nearly destroyed mine. My own experience, painful as it was, became something useful, something I could finally hand forward to someone else. Frank still comes by most Sundays. Quieter conversations now, less about generators and code compliance, more about ordinary neighborly things, football scores, Sophie's growing collection of seashells, the small, unremarkable rhythms of an ordinary life we'd once feared we might never fully get back again. Carol and I started a small, informal neighborhood support group eventually. Nothing official, just neighbors checking in on each other honestly, especially anyone caring for a family member with serious medical needs, determined that no one in Maple Ridge would ever again face something like this entirely alone in silence. Walt visits occasionally too, though less often now that his own HOA duties have ended. Always careful to ask honestly how I'm really doing, not the polite version, the real one. I've come to understand that his late, hard-won courage mattered as much to the story's ending as anyone else's. The generator itself still sits quietly behind our fence. Code compliant, properly cleared, exactly where it belongs. A small, unremarkable metal box that once became, absurdly, the center of an 18-month battle over power, control, and one woman's inability to see a real, breathing person behind a medical necessity form. Sometimes I catch myself staring at it from my window, not with anger anymore, just quiet gratitude, remembering Frank's steady hands running that first emergency cable through the dark, remembering the exact moment my ventilator's rhythm steadied again, remembering how close survival and loss had actually stood beside each other that night. I think about Deborah occasionally too. Not often, but honestly, wondering whether prison eventually taught her anything about the very thing she'd spent 18 months refusing to learn. That other people's survival isn't an inconvenience to be managed, but a reality to be respected, especially by anyone holding even small amounts of power. I hope, somewhere beneath my own hard-earned peace, that she eventually found her own version of understanding, not for her sake specifically, but because a person capable of learning that lesson causes far less harm moving forward than one who simply serves a sentence and returns unchanged to the world. Our house feels different now, lighter somehow, despite nothing physically changing about its walls or its rooms. Maybe it's simply the absence of dread. The quiet knowledge that a white SUV won't idle outside our fence tonight. That Deborah Voss's careful, patient cruelty no longer has any claim on our address. Sophie's grown noticeably braver this past year, speaking up more readily at school, less afraid of adult disapproval than she once seemed after watching her own parents fight, patiently and honestly, against someone who tried very hard to convince an entire neighborhood that fear was simply the price of order. Daniel sleeps better now too. The exhausted vigilance of those 18 months slowly replaced by something closer to ordinary tiredness. The kind that comes from ordinary work and ordinary parenting rather than constant, quiet dread about whose car might be idling outside our window at any given hour. I still wake sometimes to the steady mechanical rhythm of my ventilator, And instead of dread, I feel something closer to gratitude now. For the machine itself. For Daniel beside me. For Frank's headlights that once cut through darkness exactly when it mattered most. For a community that eventually chose truth over fear. Renata sent a short note recently, mentioning that our case had quietly become something of a reference point for other disability accommodation attorneys handling similar HOA disputes elsewhere in the state. Our documented timeline now helping other families navigate exactly the kind of fight we once faced almost entirely alone. That knowledge means more to me than almost anything else that came out of this entire ordeal. The idea that our exhausting 18 months might spare some other family, somewhere, from facing an identical dark, silent night, alone, with nothing but a dying battery and a neighbor's quiet, patient cruelty for company. Walt's successor as HOA president recently proposed naming the community's small central garden after no one in particular. Just Resilience Garden. A quiet, unofficial nod. Everyone understood without saying directly to exactly what Maple Ridge had collectively survived and rebuilt from together over that difficult year. I attended the small dedication ceremony in my wheelchair. Sophie beside me, Daniel behind us, Frank and Carol and Walt and Priya scattered comfortably among the gathered neighbors. All of us quietly, permanently changed by everything we'd fought through together, separately and then, eventually, entirely as one community, standing there, or rather sitting there, breathing steadily beside the people who'd helped keep me breathing at all. I understood finally that this story had never really been about a generator, or a setback line, or even about Deborah Voss herself. It had always been about who we choose to protect. It had been about Daniel running outside in his socks, about Frank's headlights in the dark, about Priya's trembling courage, about Walt's late but genuine bravery, about Carol's honest regret, about Renata's patient, methodical belief in the plain, undeniable power of documented truth over quiet, accumulated fear. 6 months of medical crisis had become 18 months of injustice, had become one long, terrifying night, had become, finally, an ordinary garden. Dedication on an ordinary Saturday afternoon. Sunlight warm on my face. My daughter's hands steady in mine. My heart still beating. Steadily. Gratefully. The HOA newsletter that month. Priya's first under the new permanent leadership. Ran a simple photo from the garden dedication. No names highlighted. No violations listed. Just neighbors standing together in soft afternoon light. Underneath it, a single caption, Maple Ridge Estates, built by people, not by fear. I keep that clipping now, tucked inside the same folder where Daniel once stored every fine notice, every threatening letter, every desperate piece of evidence we gathered simply trying to survive. Feels right. Somehow, ending that folder's long, painful story with something that finally looks like peace instead of proof. Sometimes, late at night, I still replay the exact sequence of that first terrible outage. The alarm, Daniel's bare feet on cold pavement, Frank's engine turning over before we'd even finished dialing for help. 11 minutes separated an ordinary Tuesday from something none of us could have survived intact. Deborah Voss shut down power to my home twice. Once quietly through paperwork. Once violently through darkness. Certain both times that rules and control mattered more than the person breathing behind them. She froze the night a generator truck finally took over her street. Headlights cutting through fear itself. What she never understood, not once, not even at the end, was that real power was never hers to begin with. It belonged to a tired ICU nurse, a sleepless husband, a steady neighbor with a truck full of cable, and an entire community that finally, together, chose courage over quiet fear. I think, too, of every family still fighting a version of our fight somewhere else tonight, still waiting for a neighbor's headlights, still hoping someone with a laminated binder might finally learn that a rule is only as good as the person willing to bend it for a life worth saving. The generator still hums quietly behind our fence tonight, exactly where it belongs, keeping steady watch over an ordinary, hard-won life. And somewhere down the street, a porch light stays on a little longer than it used to, just in case a neighbor ever needs it again. The END.